So hello, thank you for joining today. I am the Executive Director of SB at Home. My name is Regina Celestin Williams, and we are very excited to host you today for a thoughtful conversation around the City of Mountain View's emerging tenant displacement response strategy. We're looking forward to providing context and opportunity for you to further deepen your engagement as the policy topic is further developed in Mountain View, and to provide information which may be useful for advocacy for tenant protections in other communities throughout Santa Clara County. So this is a part of our Policy and Action at Home series at SB at Home. It's a monthly informal brown bag discussion, convening housers to engage on hot housing topics. Every month we select a topic or current event, bring in an expert or two to give a brief presentation, and then open up the discussion to ask questions, float new ideas, and identify potential areas for shared action. Next slide, please. So we would like to do a land acknowledgement before we begin. I would like to acknowledge the traditional, ancestral, unceded territory of the Muwekma Ohlone Ramaytush Ohlone Tamiya Nation and Ama Mutsun, on which we are learning, working, and organizing today. We are committed to honoring and making visible the Indigenous people and tribes that were intentionally displaced from their land, who remain here in Silicon Valley and are a part of our community. Thank you. I'll pass it to Corey Walbuck.
There we go. Hi, everybody. So just a few things we want to make sure that we're thinking about as we go into this event today. We do want to ensure the conversations and the relationships here today really remain respectful, and we want to make sure that we're also being productive in learning with each other. So please be kind, please be courteous to each other, please try to refrain from any rude comments or any personal attacks. We do encourage asking questions in the chat and listening as we learn and engage with each other. So please keep comments and questions focused on Mountain View's tenant displacement response strategy and policy solutions, please keep the questions in the chat on topic. Sometimes the chat can get lively, and so if you find that it is distracting you from the content of the discussion or bothering you, we encourage you to consider closing the chat temporarily. Thank you very much. I now would like to introduce my colleague, our Director of Policy, Matthew Reed, who will introduce our speakers. Matthew.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. We're very excited. This is a discussion that we've been working on bringing forward for a number of months, and we're so pleased to have Wayne and Tricia here today. Wayne Chen is the Assistant Community Development Director for the City of Mountain View, where he oversees the city's affordable housing and rent stabilization programs. Prior to joining at Mountain View, we knew Wayne at the city of San Jose, where he worked in the Department of Housing for 9 years and where he led the Housing Policy and Rent Stabilization Division. Wayne received his master's in public policy degrees from University of California at Berkeley and a master's in urban planning from Harvard University. We're also extremely excited to introduce Tricia Gonzalez, who maybe more of you do not know. Tricia is a native of Oakland and was raised in the Bay Area with lived experience in low-income housing. She's incredibly passionate about access to affordable housing for all, and her passion to understand how we can provide access and opportunity for thousands more families has led her to dedicate 15 years of her life to protecting, preserving, and producing affordable housing throughout the Bay Area region. She has worked at Mid-Penn Housing for 10 years, affordable housing producer, and has experience in both sustaining communities in property management and building communities with her work in affordable housing development. Tricia is eagerly navigating the policy landscape in Mountain View and around the Bay Area as a fellow for the Partnerships for the Bay Future. Let me briefly explain that this will come out in the presentation. SV at Home has been honored to be in partnership with the City of Mountain View and have Tricia as a dedicated fellow through the Partnerships for the Bay Future program. And so it's been a great partnership, and it's been really valuable working with both Wayne and Tricia. And with that, I will go ahead and allow us to move forward and introduce Wayne and Tricia to give their presentation.
Thank you very much, Matthew. Thank you, Regina, SV at Home, the whole SV at Home team, and everyone who's choosing to spend a portion of your day during lunch hour to have a dialogue with us. So thank you all very much and appreciate the warm welcome. What we were invited to do was to provide folks a background and setting the context for the work that the City of Mountain View is undertaking to develop a displacement response strategy. We wanted to just briefly touch on where we came from and the thought process and the principles and the framework that are guiding our work. And then talk about some of the key focus areas that we are evaluating. All this will culminate into a next step for a council study session that's currently scheduled for May the 23rd. So that, next slide, please. Matthew's already introduced both Wayne and Tricia, but I did also just want to acknowledge that we have a lot of folks who are helping us on this work. Our housing manager, Michaela Hellman-Tincher, she's out on leave right now, but has done a lot of the work prior to her leave. We have a rent stabilization team who has done a lot of work in terms of helping us to facilitate the community outreach meetings, coordinating on data as needed to help with some of the backgrounding for that. And our really great multicultural engagement program team, which we'll talk about in more detail towards the end of this presentation. But here's the background. For the past decade, the city has had increasing amount of residential development, which is great, adding to the supply of housing. However, there have been 1,000 rental units that most folks would consider to be naturally occurring affordable housing. They're older housing stock. They have been part of either redevelopment project applications that are kind of going through the process right now, or have been actually demolished to create room for new residential units. And so over the past 10 years, there have been about 1,000 rental units that are part of projects or have already been demolished. A lot of the projects were replaced with market rate row homes because these units are in these R3 zoning districts that are really set up for the densities for row houses. And so the economics of that has been really strong for that type of development. So as a result, in 2019, the City Council wanted to put displacement response on their work plan. It's a high priority item for the council, and we're actively working on this. Prior to COVID and at the beginning of COVID, we held 2 study sessions to talk about how we would embark on this work, the principles that would guide our work, and the initial policy areas that we thought would be the right places to start. Next slide, please. I wanted to spend just a moment on the background of the principles, because that will give you the context for why we are approaching our strategy the way we are. So the 5 principles, number 1 is that first, it should be multi-pronged and integrated. Displacement which could include temporary displacement or permanent displacement, can happen for a variety of reasons. And we wanted to be mindful and thoughtful about those different reasons and how different strategies may be needed to address this factor or that factor, but then also have them speak to each other. And so that they're integrated strategies and not separate strategies that are kind of doing its own thing without recognizing that there's this other thing that should be coordinated together. The strategy should be broad-based, meaning that preventing displacement is a key part of the strategy. However, there will be situations where displacement cannot be, it will occur through demolition and redevelopment projects. And in those situations, we wanted to have strategies to mitigate the impacts of displacement. The strategy needs to be collaborative and multi-sector. We know that the public sector is an important part, the city is an important part. We can't do it alone. We need partnerships for programs. We need partnerships for funding. And we are seeking partnerships across the sectors, whether it's other public partners, nonprofits, the private sector, and also a new sector that we may need to create in terms of building up the ecosystem and having new organizations that can participate in this space. The strategy should focus on tenants. So the issue of displacement may be different in different jurisdictions. For the city of Mountain View, it has been really a focus on tenants as opposed to homeowners, and tenants who are residents in our rent stabilization units covered under that program. CSFRA stands for Community Stabilization and Fair Rent Act. That was the rent stabilization program that's passed by the voters, Measure V, in 2016. Finally, the strategy should be unit and place-based. What this means is that we are seeking to have folks be able to remain in their unit, but if it's not possible, in temporary displacement would need to occur, or permanent displacement would need to occur through redevelopment projects, a way for the tenants to have a temporary place to go and move back to a new unit. Or if that is not possible, find some alternative housing option still within the city of Mountain View because of the importance of the community and the proximity to their connections, their work, their children's schools. Next slide, please. So 6 initial policy program areas: evaluating an acquisition preservation program, looking at local replacement requirements. The city has a current tenant relocation assistance ordinance more under the mitigation bucket, and there are opportunities to review it and refine that as well. Evaluating a landlord rental set-aside program, I'll get to that a little bit later. A tenant selection preference for displaced tenants, and other kind of implementing actions we may need to take in terms of adopting ordinances or regulations to implement 1 through 5 or other things that might emerge. Next slide, please. Very quickly, during COVID-19, we started with all the pieces I was just laying out, but we did have to pivot and spend a lot of resources, and like so many cities, pivoting to address immediate needs. So the city actually created a COVID-19 rent relief program, and over the last 3 years, funded it with $4.8 million of funding, which was really great, and it had such an impact in terms of stabilizing folks who were impacted by COVID. The rent stabilization team began the lifting up and piloting of the eviction help center. And over the last couple of years, it has evolved into something even broader, a housing eviction help center, where not only is it meant to help walk folks through situations where they may have gotten an eviction notice, or they may be in proceedings, but also helping folks apply for the BMR housing program, filling out applications, or rent relief funding. So those are the types of things that we're doing in the help center. Coordinating with the county on various efforts, and then leveraging the state's Project Home Key program. We have 2 Project Home Key projects. We implemented the first interim housing program in the state through Project Home Key, and we are currently working on a hotel conversion. Next slide, please. Finally, we're doing other things. the state during this time implemented SB 330. Some of you may have heard of this, but that's a pretty important bill in terms of replacement requirements, because it includes a very strong replacement requirements that are applicable in all cities with demolition projects that include demolition of protected units, which the city's rent stabilization units would fall under that category. Currently, the bill is set to sunset in 2030. So assuming no other laws or no other changes, we're looking ahead at 2030 for local replacement requirements. We've significantly increased our pipeline of affordable housing that the city would fund. And so we started just a few years ago, we had 1,200 affordable housing units that are funded by the city. We have 500 units in the pipeline, and we've expanded our BMR program as well. We have just under 200 units, but we have almost 400 units of BMR units in the pipeline at various stages. And then the city lifted up a mobile home rent stabilization ordinance as well. Next slide. I want to transition this over to Tricia and have her have the opportunity to provide more of the work through the Breakthrough Grant.
Great, thanks, Wayne. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tricia. I am the Breakthrough Grant Fellow working with the City of Mountain View. Just to give you a bit more context on the Breakthrough Grant, I am actually one of 11 fellows throughout the Bay Area region. A couple of the neighboring jurisdictions with fellows as well as East Palo Alto and San Jose. And there are various components to the fellowship. One of the key focuses is to address displacement. And in order to do that, as Matthew mentioned earlier, we have community partners, one being SV at Home. Shout out to them. They are very diligent in helping us with outreach. And we routinely engage with them with all housing related items, including displacement response. Our other community partner with the Breakthrough Grant is the Housing Trust of Silicon Valley. They're great housing partners with an expertise in funding. We work with them in brainstorming and identifying potential external partnerships that can support funding for acquisition and preservation programs. Next slide.
Thanks, Tricia. Just to move over through the slide quickly, there are other places where displacement response is showing up in the city's work. We held a study session last year with council about the overall affordable housing program and having a 5-year strategic plan. And funding and acquisition preservation was one of the 4 strategies for that 5-year plan, focusing on land trusts, opportunity purchase acts, funding partnerships, and then also developing local replacement requirements. Through the city's housing element update, the city council just adopted our latest and hopefully final version of it. And the team has done a tremendous amount of work with a significant amount of community engagement and trying to reflect as much of the community input as possible. Displacement response was added as a program, and there are various pieces to that. So we'll be implementing those pieces as part of and through the displacement response strategy. And fair housing is a key consideration as related to our displacement response, and also through the housing element. There is a affirmatively furthering fair housing requirement as part of the housing element, and that is helping to inform our work. Finally, the city has various strategic priorities that help the council determine what are the high priority topics and work items to add to the work plan on their 2-year cycle. The 2 that are very directly related to housing is facilitating a community for all and facilitating intentional development and housing options. The city also has a race, equity, and inclusion initiative, and all of these priorities and values and goals are lenses that we're using for displacement response. Next slide, please.
And just to sum up, we are facing both challenges and opportunities. One being residents are displaced when redevelopment happens, and redevelopment will continue to happen. In order to work in alignment with the city's community for all goals, we're working to support residents to either stay in place, stay in the unit, or at the very minimum, remain in the city. And we have opportunities to explore potential policies and programs to either prevent or mitigate displacement within the city of Mountain View. Next slide, please.
So thank you. This next slide is really sort of a summary, but at a high level of where we are today and where we're potentially looking to go over the next several years with shorter term, medium term, and longer term actions. But here are the buckets. It's both a prevention and mitigation. There's the two components, and then there's other responses. And we wanted to just highlight some of our existing programs, but also our potential programs. So for the existing programs, we have our rent stabilization program, as mentioned, covering both apartments and mobile homes, rental assistance programs, and the Housing Eviction Help Center. Our existing tenant relocation program, TREO, provides relocation benefits for folks who have to move to another housing location. We did do a modification in 2020, I believe, that increased the eligibility for qualifying for assistance, and then also increasing income eligibility thresholds, and also for special circumstances. And then, of course, we're implementing various state provisions related to replacement requirements. The potential programs that we're looking at are, again, what kind of program and what is needed to have an acquisition preservation program? And then how might an opportunity to purchase program be a complement to acquisition preservation to achieve certain goals? We've already talked about the funding and the partnerships, so I'll move over to the mitigation section. Council's direction for staff was to look at local replacement requirements for when state law sunsets, specifically SB 330, again in 2030. In addition to local replacement requirements, we were directed to evaluate potential options for no net loss, meaning a one-for-one replacement requirement of protected units, and also right of return or right of refusal. So the actual ability for folks to return to a new unit if it does get demolished and then is replaced. We heard from the tenants and folks through the outreach process that there were sort of two different thoughts about this. One was, how could demolition of rent stabilized units just be prevented and really have no more of those situations? We did also hear from other folks who said demolition of the units could be okay, could be manageable if there is a temporary option for folks to go to in the meantime, and then a real ability for folks to move back into the new units. So we're looking at that. And then we're also looking at preferences for displaced tenants, primarily through recently passed law SB 649 that provides some sort of provisions and affirmative provisions about priorities and preferences for displaced tenants. A lot of that is related to tax credit funded units, such as like our typical 100% affordable projects, but we're evaluating that bill and looking at the options for that. Again, true first right of return, I want to give, or refusal, I want to give folks an example of what that means. So one example is if there's a demolition project and a rental apartment building is removed and it's replaced by, say, condos, and some of those condos would need to be affordable. But if folks cannot come up with a down payment assistance or closing costs, although they may have a first right of a refusal or return, it's not real for them. So we're trying to put together programming and funding and, again, partnerships so that there may be a pool of funds to make that first right of return or refusal real for them. We are also going to be looking at our TREO, our relocation assistance ordinance, to see if there are other opportunities to modify it and address things like temporary relocation. We are, through our housing element work plan, going to be reviewing the mobile home rent stabilization ordinance and the annual general adjustment that is allowed. And we are also going to be working on a community ownership action plan to look at different models and organizations who could participate in an acquisition preservation program. Finally, we're going to be looking at regional efforts, and we have been. We're going to continue to do so, whether that's policy, programming, or funding. So with that, I want to hand it over to Tricia to talk about our outreach strategy.
Thanks, Wayne. It was really important for the city to receive feedback on existing programs. Next slide, please, Jessica. Thank you. As I was saying, it was really important for the city to receive feedback on existing programs and input on potential programs. In order to do that, we held a series of 7 stakeholder meetings. 2 of them were general sessions with community members. We then had sessions with property owners, market rate developers, and nonprofit developers. In addition to those stakeholder meetings, we also held numerous one-on-one meetings with individuals or tenant coalitions that requested such. And all of this work was in preparation for the city council session coming up on May 23rd. And as you can see on the screen there, if you had any further questions or comments beyond today's meeting, please feel free to email displacementresponse@mountainview.gov. And I think that email actually goes directly to Wayne. Thank you. Next slide.
Thank you. And through the displacement response email, we also wanted to, in addition to the formal outreach meetings, we wanted to make sure folks knew that they could schedule one-on-one meetings with the city to talk about specific issues that would be of particular concern for them, or talk generally or broadly. And so we had the opportunity to also meet with folks and organizations one-on-one as well. The folks at SV at Home thought it might be interesting to share some of the team's approach to outreach. And I think just to say, the city's race equity inclusion initiative is something that the housing team is looking at in terms of what does that mean for housing, not just for programming, but for community engagement. And so we've been really starting to incorporate affirmative, intentional strategies, again, in addition to actual development of programs and implementing programs, but reducing barriers and increasing access for folks to be able to connect with a participatory process related to things like developing a strategy, related to things like the housing element. And we've started this process. We've been doing this for a while, but I think we've been really trying to step that up. And we feel that developing relationship and trust is really important. We have different ways of trying to do that. I mentioned our multicultural engagement program team, who provides translation interpretation services in Spanish, Chinese, Mandarin, and Russian as needed. I've already mentioned the Help Center. We also have a Spanish and Chinese Leadership Academy program. It's a civic engagement program. It's a leadership program. And we have cohorts that come through the city every year through this program. They learn about the different functions of the city, and housing is always its own module. And folks always have a lot of really good questions about that. And then folks then go out into the community and they become liaisons to their community groups with the city. They help provide information, share information. And so those are some of the ways that we've developed programming and infrastructure to do this sort of approach. And we have a continuous learning and improvement mindset. We know there are different ways of doing things. We want to hear and listen and hear, and then see if there are ways that we can incorporate feedback into how we approach our work and how we approach engagement. And so this is reflected in ways such as for the tenant stakeholder meetings, we had both virtual and in person. And the in-person one was the first one we've done for like 3 years. And so we also wanted to include things like what would actually help folks go out and meet in person. And so we had a good room set up. We had housing folks there. We had planning folks there. Tricia was there. We had childcare provided. We had food provided because we knew that would be one way to help families join and participate. So those are just some concrete examples, but we're always learning and improving. So with that, I think that concludes our presentation, and would be very happy to engage in dialogue.
Great. Thank you so much, Wayne and Tricia. We're looking forward to some back and forth, and I see there's a couple of questions coming in the chat. I wanted to start by just taking a step back. Mountain View is sort of the bird in the coal mine, because you've seen a level of demolition that nobody else has seen, but I think everybody knows is coming. And you got pretty clear, but also very broad and flexible direction from your council. Find a comprehensive approach to the pieces of this displacement problem, and importantly, keep folks in the community. That's a big, but it's also very broad. And I know that can be daunting, but it can also be really empowering for a city and for a community to engage with that question. We see places where cities raise issues and then staff goes small because they don't really trust that the city council really wants them to do the things that they need to do to achieve the goals. So what's different in Mountain View? Do you feel like this is going to bode well going forward, or are we going to hit a wall of like, oh, that's not what we meant? Because there's a lot here. And, do you have a strategy about that? That's
a really great question, Matthew, and I appreciate that kind of big picture sort of start. I really should say at the outset that our city council is so great on housing, and they've been great on housing for a while. And staff, city manager's office, the leadership through staff is all so supportive of housing. And we certainly have many goals in addition to housing, but housing has certainly been a key priority. The way that we approach our work begins, I think, in many ways with council. We have strategic priorities that start us off in a certain direction. And then, as mentioned, especially for these really meaty and multifaceted topics, we want to have study sessions, at least one, to share the thinking and the framework. And that's where the principles really come in, because that creates a structure within which we can do staff's work. And depending on the topic, it may be broader, it may be more focused, but we kind of test our thinking, we provide a framework, we get feedback, and then we move forward with a framework that folks agree with. And then, yes, for this one, community input was really important. And so we got a lot of good community feedback through this. I think this process has been interesting and maybe unique because of COVID sort of landing in the middle of that. And then as a result, the timing of this starting to align with the housing element update process. And so there are various pieces that started to converge. And so I mentioned the various forces that sort of continue to shape this process. But because there has been a little bit of time, new things have emerged, we want to go back with a study session before bringing, for example, an ordinance back or an actual program for a council vote. And we want to make sure that we're continuing on the right track. We want to provide an update, and we want to provide updated thinking about these topic areas and get council's affirmation or reaffirmation that we should be moving in that direction. And then from then on, we can start implementing actual policies and programs. So I think the leadership, clear priorities, having a process where we have check-ins with council and establishing principles and framework really help our work, especially on complicated topics. And community input. That's helpful. I didn't hear the, yeah, this is going to be easy going forward part, but I know that there's a good foundation.
So it's often, folks in the community know what the experience is because it's, ever present, the instability, the stress, and then the experience of losing your home and trying to figure out how to keep your life together and stay connected. And sometimes we start with a tool. This is the policy that we're going to advocate for. And I think, there was a little bit different process here because you really started with let's listen some more. Let's listen to the community, create space to sort of talk about the process that people are experiencing, and then shape the policy solutions around that. And that's why it's such a comprehensive or complex set of initiatives. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that. And I'm really interested in how you think that is going to help you move these policies through the political process, and whether you think it's going to help keep people engaged as this goes forward. How do we keep the community folks involved that have been given the space to plug in up to this point?
Yeah, I think, big picture, there's always the ability to start from a solution and kind of work back and build in the details and then connect it with a, actual or perceived issue. And then going the other way, you start with the stories. You start with the input from folks who have lived experience, and then you say, here's a situation, what do we do about it? I think for our work, we do both. When you start from the stories, it helps to create the options that may be broader, and then you can start to focus them down. But there may be some things that make sense to just put on your list of options that you want to study. And then as you go through the process, you determine whether those specific policies or programs would be relevant, or whether they be relevant but need to be developed in a certain way and structured in a certain way to meet local needs. So there's this top-down and bottoms-up approach. But again, the framework and principles really help to put kind of posts around to make sure that we're still moving in a right direction that has been agreed upon and approved by council. We envision having continued input from the public. This is a topic that folks feel very passionately about, no matter the stakeholder group that is being represented. So we continue to email folks who've registered for the interest list. We have emails that go out in again multiple languages to tenants, property owners, mobile home park owners, and mobile home park residents. And we'll do things like updating our website and whatnot. But through after the study session, and as we actually develop programs to bring back to council for approval, we would envision having appropriate community engagement and in a way that gets input from all the folks, tenants, property owners, residents, etc. So we would continue with that approach.
Great. I want to be cognizant of time. I want to ask if there's one thing that you felt you learned you didn't expect to learn, and is there a kind of a solution that came out of that back and forth that you think is worth highlighting?
I think through the engagement process, we heard folks from different stakeholders. I think I just saw a question pop up about the private sector. I think the comments that we received were pretty much what we might have anticipated. I think that one of the pieces that came up was the interest that tenants and tenant groups really want to be part of the solution, right? And not just be folks who might be subject to displacement, whether that's trying to form organizations who can undertake activities or purchase properties or try to fundraise. So I think that was a really interesting and great piece, because the ecosystem is something that we've been talking about a lot. How do we get folks who want to participate, who have a different maybe model that they have in mind? And there's going to be a lot of work to kind of lift up those pieces. But I think that was one that emerged that was great to see.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I think sometimes we need more than policies to get stuff done, and figuring out how to really support the capacity is going to be so important for cities all over the Bay Area going forward. And it's a major topic of discussion. Let me quickly go to some questions from the chat. There is one about Treo. I think we've covered a little bit more of that. It came in before you had addressed that in the chat. If folks want to talk more about that, reach out to me or somebody else on the policy team at SV at Home. This is a policy that was adopted last week in Sunnyvale. It's in 2 or 3 other housing elements, so it's important to be moving forward. I don't want this to be too broad, but there's a lot of interest in how do we take these lessons and move them to other cities? And the one that's come through specifically in the chat, which is maybe the focus, is there something that the advocacy groups or the community groups that are doing that is especially constructive in opening up opportunities to engage with you all? If you had to make recommendations, this is how to do it best when you want stuff from us, what would you say?
That's such a great question. And, certainly recently we've just seen so much engagement, and advocacy groups formed and really caring about housing. And I think generally most folks have a very much kind of shared kind of direction, but certainly different groups will have different areas that they might think about in the way that they feel is aligning with their organization. What I would just say where I found engagement to be particularly helpful for when staff is trying to receive input is when folks have like an ability to create space for dialogue, and that there's sort of shared listening, and being able to allow us the space to describe sort of like the task that staff is charged with, and then kind of explaining where that comes from and maybe some thinking behind that. And then similarly, to really understand the thinking behind input that we receive. And then oftentimes we could get down into very specific things like, oh, tell us more about that. Oh, help us better understand your perspective of, if there's this sort of issue here, there might be maybe a counter issue here. How do you all think about that? And so that really helps us understand what the input entails. I think input where they might be more general, or if folks may not be ready to kind of drill down into the kind of the specifics or the thinking, it's harder for staff to be able to understand what it is and how to reflect it. And so we've had really great conversations with folks who are like willing and able to kind of unpack what's behind their approach. that's always seemed to be really helpful, because then
Yeah.
we can understand it.
Yeah.
I don't know if that was helpful or if that
No,
was
that is.
responsive.
I mean, what I'm hearing below the surface is it takes a lot of mutual trust and mutual respect. And creating the spaces for that to be effective can be tough. But that's really valuable when you can pull that together. And I think you've seen that through this experience. You know, I missed this question initially, but I think it's really important because I know it was important to you. And we're tight on time, but I want to make sure that we do talk about this. What have you heard from the private sector, landlords and developers? None of these solutions work without everybody being a part of the process in some way. And how has that shaped the discussion about the policy solutions?
Yeah, primarily what we've heard from the private sector, and by that I'll just reflect, I suppose the property owner stakeholder group and the market rate developer stakeholder group, is their primary input was just focused on supply. It was that the way to address housing needs is reducing costs and streamlining the development process, and which the city understands as well. We have a process where we're reviewing our development review and permitting process. Through the housing element, we're looking at ways to reduce costs and fees in other areas. I think the particular dynamic in Mountain View is that the type of displacement we're talking about is related specifically when supply is being added by redeveloping an existing site with existing units on it. And so some input that we've heard when we sort of try to bring it to that is you know, a willingness to try to partner on innovative options. It seemed like there was maybe a little bit like some interest to find ways for temporary relocation. We didn't get a whole lot of feedback on Opportunity Purchase Act programs, but we did receive one feedback that said if it was, you know, geared more towards tenants, that was maybe more tenable. But primarily, it was supply, adding supply.
Don't mess this up. Okay. Those are the questions that we have. Trisha, Wayne, it was a pleasure to have you here. I have the benefit of seeing you on a regular basis. I'm glad we could share that with the rest of the folks that were able to attend today. It's always a pleasure. This is exciting stuff, and we're looking forward to the next steps. And so hopefully we'll have opportunities to come back and talk about all of the tremendous outcomes as well as the process. So we really appreciate you being here today. Let me hand the floor back, I believe, to Corey from our team to talk a little bit about what you all and what we all can do to follow through on this discussion. Corey?
Thank you very much, Matthew. And could we just take a moment and really appreciate maybe show a reaction or put something in the chat to show appreciation to Trisha and Wayne for joining us today and for really sharing their process and their thinking with us and being so open to hearing our questions, not just today, but to hearing from us in the future. I really do appreciate their openness and transparency with us. So if we could go to the next slide. Actually, before we get to that, sorry, go back just one more. I first forgot to mention, this is our policy in action. Oh, sorry, just the next slide again. Where you were was good. Sorry, Jessica. This is our policy in action. And so we like to end this event with a call to action. So here's our call to action. If you live, work, or are connected in any way to Mountain View, we encourage you to make your voice heard in advance of that May 23rd meeting. And beyond, as the City of Mountain View continues to develop these policy solutions to address tenant displacement. You can keep up to date on the city's website using the link that we're going to post again in the chat. And you can also reach the team that you heard from today, Tricia and Wayne, you can reach them in the City of Mountain View as well at the email that we're also going to post in the chat again. So thank you, Kenneth, for posting those links for the website and the email. Again, that email is just displacementresponse@mountainview.gov. And for those of you who, this is part 2 of our ask, for those of you who don't live in Mountain View and don't have a strong connection to the city of Mountain View, but you live, work, or have connections in other cities throughout St. Clair County, we encourage you to reach out to your own city leaders, city staff, community groups, elected officials, mayor, city council in your own city, to talk about how your community can pursue process and strategies similar to what Mountain View is doing to address displacement of tenants, because it is a huge problem impacting a lot of people and families throughout every corner of the county. So with that, Jessica, now we could go to the last slide. Sorry, I got ahead of myself earlier. SV at Home is a membership organization, and we do believe that everyone deserves a safe, stable, affordable home. That's central to our work. And if you do too, we encourage you to become a member. When you join SV at Home, we can leverage our resources, magnify our voices, and advance strategic, collaborative solutions to California and our region's affordable housing crisis that meet our local and regional needs. Your membership helps support our work. Things like today's event, like our ongoing policy and action events. And you can find the link to join us in the chat as well. So we'll put it there. And together we can work towards solving the Bay Area's housing crisis.